It sounds like they've changed the way they Zoom, maybe updated or something. Okay, because that's something new. Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Sandy Rosenthal, host of Beat the Big Guys podcast, and I'm really, really excited about the guest with us today. His name is Peter Jung. Let me tell you a little bit about him before we start. Peter Jung has lived in the Hudson Valley of New York State for 40 years. In 1998, Peter got involved with a grassroots citizen group called Friends of Hudson that was founded by his friend Sam Pratt. For 7 years, the group resisted a proposal by an international conglomerate to build the world's largest coal-burning cement plant right on top of the local water supply, a nursing home, and a hospital. Not only did Friends of Hudson win that battle to stop the plant, it also resulted in a loss of $59 million for the company, which failed to get a single permit. This is an amazing story, and I can't wait to hear more about it. Hello, Peter.
Greetings from the 518 area code.
And here we are in 504 area code. It's interesting. They both begin with 5 and we're on opposite sides of the country.
Yeah, well, we're up about 120 miles north of New York City along the east bank of the Hudson River. We're in that odd little strip of New York along the Massachusetts and Connecticut and Vermont borders. And we look across the river at the Catskill Mountains. We're about 40 miles south of Albany, the state capital, and about 4 hours south of Montreal, about 3 hours to Boston. And we're in a unique and quite wonderful position. It's a beautiful rural county called Columbia County, and it's largely unspoiled. It has not been suburbanized. It's far enough out of the city to be an attractive rural environment, but it's also not the boondocks. You know, there's interesting food and life and people and music and culture around here. So it's a really, really nice situation. And we're spending a lot of time trying to defend it against these predatory outside interests that would like to mess it up.
So, and one of those battles was a very successful one, and I can't wait to hear even more about it. But before we start, I Googled you, Peter. I Googled Peter Jung, and up came Peter Jung Fine Art. So can you tell us a little bit about your art gallery?
Yes, I'm in this town of about 6,000 people, which is, like many of the old towns in the Hudson Valley, sort of a post-industrial nightmare. The jobs had gone off to, the third world, and things were not looking good. But we had the advantage of a very beautiful location, beautiful 19th century architecture, and right on the Amtrak line. So we had some natural advantages. And about 20 years ago, a renaissance began to happen, and I was one of the early ones. I came here 31 years ago. And the wonderful old buildings needed renovation, and that is ongoing today. And I established an art gallery. We happen to live right at the epicenter of where the great Hudson River paintings were painted. That period between 1825 and 1875, you had artists like Thomas Cole, Asher Duran, Sanford Robinson Gifford. They were all right here in our area. And some of their homes today are museums, but they painted these spectacular sort of romantic landscapes that inspired America and gave us a sense of what our national landscape looked like. And those paintings were important and rather expensive in their day. Then they went through a long period of decline when nobody cared. In the 1950s, nobody was paying attention. But there has been a revival and a new interest in that great art. And now, of course, they're highly sought after. When they come up for sale, everybody and their brother is trying to buy them. It's a very rich and wonderful tradition. And I am right here at the geographical center of where that all happened in the 19th century.
Well, I'm born and raised in Massachusetts, in the eastern part of the state, and I went to school in the western part of the state. And now I have a hankering to go visit your area of New York the next time I'm up there.
Come on up.
Should I come in the summer or the winter?
The best times, I think, are late May, early June. and then again late September, early October. Those are the two time frames that I enjoy the most.
Yeah, I remember enjoying them the most as well. So I am so antsy for you to start telling your story. I've read about it. I've read something online called "The Bullet We Dodged," which was a written story about the battle to stop the plant. And I after I read it, I was hungry for more. I wanted to know more about it. And there should be a book, and hopefully, if that book will come out one day. But for today, let's hear how you were involved in the battle to stop the plant, the St. Lawrence cement plant.
Well, we had had a little bit of experience with a previous issue. A couple years before the cement plant proposal was announced, the city of Hudson had $600,000 in economic development money to give away. And so they put out an RFP, and it was answered by a couple of guys from Canada who wanted to come here and transport all the toxic sludge from the dry cleaning process, which contains one of the world's most carcinogenic elements, something called perchloroethylene. And
it sounds bad.
Unbelievably bad idea. And they were going to drag it through the city streets and process it right on our waterfront. I mean, the idea was so horrific, you could hardly believe anybody was actually proposing this.
And about what year was this?
That would have been 96.
Not that long ago.
Not that long ago, yes. And so our little grassroots group sprung up around that issue. And so we already had a little bit of a cohesive, band of individuals who was paying attention, and we took action on that one.
But how big? I mean, it wasn't thousands. It was about how big was this group?
Maybe 15, 20 people.
That's not a whole lot of people. And that's something I'd love our listeners to notice. It doesn't take hundreds and hundreds of people. A small group is often enough. But anyway, but you go on.
So we managed to shoot that down in short order. And then one day in 98, we woke up to this cheerful little postcard in our mailbox that said, "Hi, we're St. Lawrence Cement, and we'd like to be your new neighbor." And my heart sank, because in my travels, I'm very familiar with the other cement towns in the Hudson Valley. We've got a fair amount of limestone deposits along the banks of the Hudson. And of course, the river serves as barge transportation. So it's an attractive way for the cement companies to locate themselves and produce their product. But the towns that have played host to the cement industry are a mess. They're economically depressed. They're not attractive. Nobody's building new homes. There's no young families moving in. They are the armpits of the Hudson Valley. But the industry had been here probably since about 1900. And typically what they do is they come in, they blast a monstrous hole in the ground, they leave their rusting junk in the landscape, and then they walk away. And the ownership of these entities typically is either German, French, or Swiss. That's where the big, international cement conglomerates are headquartered. So basically what they do is they come in and treat us as a third world country and impose a tremendous amount of environmental downside and basically leave us with the mess. I live in Hudson, and within about 15 miles of my house, I can show you 5 abandoned cement facilities, and I'll send you some photos of them. They're a nightmare. They look like the aftermath of Chernobyl, the Russian nuclear plant that blew up. And sadly, not only are the companies not doing a good job of cleaning up after themselves, but our local civic leaders, politicians, the counties, the state are not being assertive enough in forcing these companies to clean up their act. And they're leaving this rusting junk right in one of the most beautiful landscapes you could possibly imagine, the mid-Hudson Valley region with the Catskill Mountains and the magnificent river valley. So besides their operational impacts, the aftermath of their activities is a big problem as well.
Very, very good points. And you paused, and so I'm going to jump in and say it's interesting that these cement plants aren't in the US. They're not US companies.
Yeah, they tend to be Swiss, German, and French, and in some cases they're allied with each other. They do these, combinations and partnerships. In fact, the company we fought against was headquartered in Zurich, Switzerland. Their name is Wholesome, and they're anything but wholesome.
What an
It's
interesting
spelled
name.
Holcim.
I see. Now,
And
why are these cement plants all from outside of the US?
that's a good question. I would have guessed the best answer is that they couldn't do this same stuff in their own country.
Yeah.
And that's one of the points we made during our 7-year struggle with Wholesome. What they proposed to do here in the Hudson Valley would have been illegal in their own country. They never could have gotten permits. And in fact, at one point, we assembled a few hundred of our supporters and we went down to the Swiss embassy in New York City and stood on the street and raised hell. That was a lot of fun. It was one of our more successful public theater events.
It's easy when you're asking a reasonable question and making a valid point. That's when people will sit up and take notice, especially
Yeah.
when it's not all about just you. It's
Yeah.
about a whole town or a whole city. But anyway, carry on. This is great.
I think for anyone involved in a grassroots resistance movement to any of these nightmare proposals, one of the most important things that you need to do is to frame the issue and lay it out there so that people understand it. These things are complicated. The review process and all the administrative complexity surrounding that is really intimidating. I mean, the environmental impact statement that the cement company filed was 2,000 pages. It came in 5 volumes and weighed about 40 pounds. It was an overwhelming amount of information. And a few of us fanatics, of course, are willing to dig in and read the fine print. But the average person who's just trying to live their life and put food on their table for their kids doesn't have the wherewithal or the inclination to invest themselves that deeply.
And that's what the big guys expect. That's
they
what they
expect apathy and disengagement. Exactly.
Or
So
people are just too busy.
Yep. And so a lot of our job was just to present this issue in a way that would inform people and get them riled up enough to become active. And in that regard, visuals were really important. I'll tell you one entertaining little story. My friend Sam Pratt was our fearless leader and strategic genius. And, we won that battle largely because of his just insane level of commitment. And I just can't say enough about what he did for this community. It was a very generous act on his part to devote 7 years of his life, literally 7 years. But he came up with this graphic where he made a visual rendering of the proposed smokestack right immediately next to the Statue of Liberty. And the Statue of Liberty, of course, is the ultimate American icon. So here you have the Statue of Liberty with her torch and, inviting the poor and oppressed of the world to come to New York. And right next to it, this massive smokestack belching out this cocktail of toxic pollutants. And that visual had an incredible impact on people. It made the proposed cement plant look a lot more ominous, and it hit people in that visceral place in their belly, because you can overwhelm people with data and graphs and charts and numerical stuff. But when they see it in a purely graphic form, simplified and made really in your face, that had a tremendous impact. So to the extent that I might be advising any other citizens groups, I would say make good use of visuals.
Everyone in the world knows the Statue of Liberty, and certainly everyone in America can draw it if they had to. The Statue of Liberty, it has a feel about how high it is, and I can expand on that a little bit. In my own book, Words Whispered in Water, I had to convince people in the city that we needed to preserve a flooded home so that no one would forget what happened here. And I went before city council and I held up a photograph of the 3 huge steel beams stuck in the ground those disturbing steel beams that were stuck in the ground after the 9/11 Twin Tower collapse. Because everyone in the world remembers those, except for one thing. They weren't preserved. They were taken down one by one for search and rescue and for forensics to sort of figure out why this disaster happened. They were not preserved. And using that image, I was able to put through a very, very difficult proposal to preserve a flooded house in an actual residential neighborhood. But yes, hone in on key things that people understand, that everyone understand. That's really, thank you. That was really an excellent point.
The other thing that worked really well for us, and I kind of think we were unique in this respect, we didn't base our opposition to the plant purely on environmental factors. We also attacked the economics of it. And I think to the extent that other folks might be facing similar challenges, if you dig down into the economics, you will often find that the company's proposition is actually quite weak and in fact might be a negative on your local economy. And in our case, the cement company was forced to file a very extensive sort of economic prospectus. And we read it. We read every word of it. And by the time we got done, we said, my God, there's one job in this deal, because they were going to give all the jobs at this plant to their old employees from another plant across the river that they were closing down. So we were going to be absorbing a tremendous amount of downside impact for one job. The profits were going to be going off back to the investors and management in Switzerland. There was nothing good about this. So what happened was we had a local employer. He's a guy who ran a factory. I think he was the largest employer in the county. He had 400 or 500 employees. And at one point, he wrote an editorial opposing the siting of this cement plant. And that was a turning point for us, because that gave us legitimacy within the mainstream business community. Because typically what will happen is, if you're coming at it from a purely environmental standpoint, the company will be very successful at marginalizing you as a bunch of hippies, right? Tree huggers, hippies. But the minute you turn it around and make the conversation about economics and you attack their proposal on that ground, it's transformative. So.
Excellent. This is really excellent. So you mentioned that an influential person in the town wrote a letter to the editor, to the local newspaper, against the plant, but didn't that newspaper also received what I understand were fake letters?
Yes, sure.
Can you talk about that a little more?
Sure. The company had a public relations department. I think there were two guys who were basically hired guns, who came in, and they did just absolutely hilarious things. I mean, I'll describe a few of them for you. And looking back, it's really a hoot. They would write fake letters, and they would sign them, and the signature on the letter would be by somebody we knew very well who was not capable of composing that letter. No way. And they would send out postcards every few weeks. This is my favorite. They sent out a postcard telling us that this new cement plant would be such a technological marvel that busloads of tourists would come to Hudson to witness it. They also sent out a postcard. Have you ever heard of the sewers of Paris? Apparently, the sewers of Paris were engineered in the 13th century, and they, at the time, they were a marvel of hydraulic engineering. Now they've been abandoned since, and I think they've now become some sort of an underground tourist attraction. But they told us their cement plant would be so wonderful that it would draw tourist traffic and be the rival to the sewers of Paris. This is the kind of stuff they were telling us. I mean, it was just unbelievable. They went into our local minority neighborhood. We've got one part of town is heavily African-American and Bangladeshi. It's an area known as the Second Ward. And they went into that neighborhood with free t-shirts and baseball caps and hot dogs and popsicles for the kids. There were going to be 0 jobs for anybody in that community. They went there because they wanted this. They wanted the political support of the minority community. And that's just a devious and shameful thing to do. So anyway, when you begin these fights, if you're a small grassroots citizens group, it's pretty easy to feel small and intimidated and freaked out by the enormity of what you're facing. You're looking at a multinational conglomerate worth hundreds of billions of dollars. They've got teams of lawyers, they've got publicity departments. But then after you're in this for a while, you realize these guys are idiots. I mean, just complete bozos. They were clumsy. They had no idea how to navigate the local political culture. They didn't think that we were smart enough to pay attention and actually read the material, which we did. And there brings me to another point. If you're involved in one of these big, highly complex industrial propositions, simply reading the material is worth a lot, because as you noted earlier, the company is banking on the fact that the citizens are not going to pay attention. So,
And often, unfortunately, that's true.
yeah.
Often,
Yeah.
a little
Yeah.
bit
No,
too
true.
often.
And the biggest challenge really was not fighting the company. The biggest challenge is dealing with apathy and cluelessness and disengagement in your own community, even among friends of yours who should know better, and getting them engaged and getting them active and
Well, how did you do
participating.
it?
Yeah.
How did you do that?
As I said, the graphics were important. And I think in your previous chat with Sam, he spoke a lot about our sort of missionary approach, which was to knock on doors and just get together with people in their own homes and present the story. And if you had a group of friends, let's say 4 or 5 or 6 friends, and they gathered around your kitchen table over donuts and coffee, the message comes through to them in a very, very different way than it would if they saw it on a website or if they read it on a sheet of paper. It's really a different thing to just show up in person and chat with people, let them ask questions, and then they're getting the message in the home of someone who they love and trust and respect. And so therefore the message has a much higher percentage chance of getting through successfully. We must have done 300 of those. And it was very, very effective. And that's really how we built our group. We ended up with, I think our citizens group grew to 4,500 people. We got something like 15 or 20,000 petition signatures. We had people in other states, joining us, because the potential pollutant effects of this thing were not just on our little city. It was much broader and much more regional.
That's incredible. But of course, it probably took a while to get to the point where other states were coming along. I just want to point out here that if any of the listeners to this podcast are not from a small community, they might be a little overwhelmed by the idea of knocking on, a million people's doors. And I want to point out that we have something called neighborhood associations, and neighborhood associations are very happy to have community activists, community leaders in their towns come in and give bullet points about something going on. In fact, I'm supposed to be at a neighborhood meeting next month to talk about a public tennis court issue going on right now in New Orleans. So you can take advantage. If you can't go knocking on every door, you can go give a short presentation before at neighborhood committee meetings. And they love having people do stuff like that. They love it.
Yeah. We learned so much in the course of doing this. And I guess if there's a dark side, is that in the course of this, you're confronted with seeing the dark underbelly of how things work. The apathy and the disengagement among your local civic officials, the way the departments up at the Department of State or Department of Environmental Conservation in Albany were kind of wired to be sympathetic to the applicant. You get a real lesson in the workings of the world, both politically and administrative. And that was frustrating. There were many times when, we were feeling like we're not only trying to stop a cement plant, we're trying to change a culture. And
So
and
what
really,
did you do on those days where you felt discouraged?
I
What
don't
did
think
you
we
do?
ever got discouraged so much, but we sometimes, I think, and I'm speaking for myself here, we sometimes just were overwhelmed with the enormity of the weight of the status quo. I guess that's the best way to say it. There are a lot of people out there defending the status quo. And in a small town such as ours that had a history of cement production, there were two prior cement plants here beginning about 1900, and they operated for about 60, 70 years. So there was a certain cultural predisposition to favoring the company.
Mhm.
And if your grandpa and your brother-in-law and your uncle and your sister and everybody else worked in that industry at some point, it's not easy for you to stand up and oppose the industry because it's sort of baked into your DNA. And dealing with those kinds of cultural challenges was a part of this struggle. That it's not easy. Um,
How did you deal
and
with that?
well,
You
you
obviously
know,
did.
we did the best we could. I think sometimes there are some people who you're not going to drag over to your side, no matter how much convincing information you have. It would be like trying to turn a Trump supporter around. Good luck with that. You're better off trying to engage somebody who's maybe standing on the sidelines and hasn't paid attention the way they should.
There are
You're
some
much better.
people with whom you have to say to yourself, it's pointless to engage further.
Yep. Right.
It is
Yep.
pointless to engage further and just
Right.
let it go.
Yeah, exactly. Because it's not an efficient use of your time and resources.
Bingo.
Um,
Bingo.
we found out, for instance, one of the things that really set me off was the fact that we found out that the company had been lobbying the governor's office for 2 years before we even learned about the project.
2 years.
2 years. Yep. And that's the kind of thing that really made me dig in my heels, because what it says is that the people who are going to be impacted, those of us who live on the ground locally, the citizens and taxpayers, were the last ones to find out about this monstrous imposition on our quality of life, right?
By then, it's a done deal.
A done deal. And we heard that phrase a million. There were two phrases that they constantly used: done deal and state of the art technology. They use that phrase repeatedly in all their advertisements and so forth. But we were incredibly persistent. We were at this 7 days a week, 24/7. And slowly but surely, we built up the movement. We did have our local doctors at the hospital. We had a very large group of them. I think maybe as many as 80 or 90 or 100 doctors signed a letter of opposition to the plant based on health considerations.
Excellent.
So we had
that's allies.
Big time allies. Yeah. And of course they enjoy status in the community. And so between them and this fellow who had a big manufacturing plant who came out on our side, those were two huge steps in terms of legitimizing us and bringing us more into the mainstream,
That's so good. I'm going to write that down. Allies bring legitimacy and credibility.
Yep. Because the company's going to do everything they can to make it look like you're a bunch of hippies and a bunch of tree huggers who don't understand economics. And, they're going to do everything they can. And they're absolutely shameless. Ultimately, what happened in our case is one of the guys who worked in public relations for the company, he had a falling out with the company, and he came to us later and told us some pretty juicy stuff, which I will not repeat here. But
before or after you'd won your
afterwards,
okay.
Yeah, and
it'll make a good story anyway.
Yeah. And he
it'll go in the movie.
By the way, have you seen 2 Square Miles? Did I send you that link?
No.
It's a documentary film about the city of Hudson, done just after the cement battle ended in 2005.
I look forward to viewing it.
I'll send you the link. It's not all about the cement plant, but a good percentage of it is.
I
So,
look forward to that. So I'm going to point something out that you said that's so valuable. I want our listeners to be sure they got it. And then I want to ask you a question. Okay.
yep.
So I'd like to point out, and this is something that every person who's trying to beat the big guys is going to experience. There's going to be moments where you feel this is harder than I thought it would be and taking longer than I thought it would be. These moments are going to happen. And you need to look for ways to give yourself strength and calm when this happens. I think a great thing to do is exercise and
Hmm.
time with family and friends to
Hmm.
decompress, because
Yep.
these times are going to come. You're a human being. You're not a robot. And
Yep.
even if you're really good at deflecting, you mentioned, you just got finished saying that the tactics of the big guys is shameless, and they will try anything, and they'll throw a lot at you, and you just have to remember it isn't about you. It's them. It's their tactics. It's what they do, and it has nothing to do with you. But I have a question though. You brought something up which I thought was so interesting. How those fake letters to the editor that the company was writing. How did you catch them, and what did you do about it when you found out they were writing fake letters? What did you
Well,
do
of
with this?
course, we had a very substantial citizens group who was capable of crafting really good letters founded in fact, because the letters that were coming, the fake letters, they were never ever based in data, fact, reality. They were always written to appeal to local sentiment, to, let's say, nostalgia for the good old days of the cement plant, you know. And so it was pretty easy for us to shoot these down, because they were always trying to, the company did everything they could to aggravate the cultural divide in the community. We have a long time manufacturing, base here, which of course has pretty much evaporated and does not exist. Those jobs are now off to the third world. And so there, among a certain class of people, there is some nostalgia for the good old days when you could pick up a lunch bucket and go to work at the big red brick factory, right? That's gone now. And then there has been a significant migration of new people to this community because it's so attractive from the standpoint of architecture and environment and so forth. It's lovely. So the company was always trying to aggravate a perceived division between those two cultures. So their public relations effort was never based in facts. Imagine yourself as a public relations specialist for St. Lawrence Cement. And here's your job. You got to come into a community and tell them there's going to be no jobs at the new plant. All those jobs are going to the old employees from 10 miles across the river. There's going to be a plume coming out of the smokestack that's going to be 7 miles long. It's going to be right on top of the nursing home, the water supply, and the hospital. There's going to be blasting 5 days a week in the quarry that shakes the whole community. There's going to be massive barges idling next to our waterfront park on the river. There's going to be a 25,000 pound flow daily of toxic emissions, which includes carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, lead, mercury, arsenic, volatile organic compounds. And all the profits from this enterprise are going to go off to Switzerland. Now, imagine yourself as a public relations specialist whose job it is to go into a community and bullshit them into accepting that proposition. It's ridiculous. And now that we're
can't rely
removed,
on the facts. The
yeah,
data is not
no,
going to support it. Right.
they could not rely on the facts. They had an impossible task. Our task was to get people in our community to pay attention to the facts and not just rely on nostalgia for the good old days of manufacturing and all that stuff.
So when you discovered that those letters were fake, what did you do with that information that the company was writing fake letters?
I don't recall any
Okay.
specific techniques. I think our response was basically just to write more and better letters than
Okay.
they did.
Okay. Do
And,
you
and,
have, are there any words of encouragement that you can offer listeners today who have their own big guys in their own neighborhoods?
sure. Well, one of the things that you and I should talk about, and we should speak with Sam and other activists who have had some success around the country, is the idea of perhaps putting together a citizens kit. It could be a website, it could be a blog, it could be, whatever the format,
Maybe a manual.
a manual. The early stages of these battles are really critical, because let's say you're living out in Oklahoma or Iowa or somewhere out in the country, and all of a sudden your community is confronted with this massive industrial proposition, which looks pretty frightening. What do? You don't have an organization, you've got no money, you don't have an attorney, you don't have any experience, you don't speak the language of this industry with all the acronyms and so forth.
And you don't have a $100,000 PR firm.
Exactly. So the way you would react in that moment is really important. And maybe what we could do is assemble a set of talking points or insights that we could provide to help people, particularly in those first few months. For instance, here's a good one for you. As I mentioned, don't forget economics. Don't rely exclusively on environmental issues, because you'll get marginalized. Take economics into account. Read the application. Take the time to read the application. And if you have to parcel it out, you might have an accountant in your town who could handle the financial stuff. You might have a marketing expert in your town. Let them parcel it out. And that's what we did. We divided it up. In New York State, we have something called SEQR, State Environmental Quality Review Act. It's a piece of legislation that provides kind of the roadmap and the format by which these applications are processed and reviewed. We're lucky in New York State. We probably have a more progressive and good, statute in that regard. But one of the things that we did really early on is we were able to achieve intervener status. So if you're going to be a participant, if you're going to be in the hearings, if you're going to have a seat at the table, you need to actually achieve intervener status, and you have to apply for it. And Sam was all over this. And when the issue first arrived, we applied to the Department of Environmental Conservation to be an intervener. And there were 2 or 3 other citizens groups that did similar things. So what that meant is, as the process moved along, we were CC'd on all the official communications. We got to see all the data that the company submitted. We were in the loop on all the communications. And that's a super big deal. Had we not known about applying to be an intervener, we would have been standing on the outside. So those are the kinds of specific, techniques that I think would be helpful. We had some natural advantages here, and I guess we were unique in ways. We had SEQR, a fairly progressive piece of state legislation. We had access to financial resources that not every community would, and that was very helpful. We were able to hire a powerful engineering firm that was every bit as good as the cement company's engineering firm.
But it sounds like you took advantage of what you had.
We did.
And every community is going to have some advantages.
Some resources.
Yeah. But use what you have. And
most importantly, we had Sam Pratt. I mean,
Sam Pratt,
just extraordinary commitment and leadership. So we were blessed in those 3 respects, but every community will have their own set of advantages. And of course, now you have digital connectivity. You have email, blogs, website, iPhones with camera capability and video capability. That stuff can be quite useful to a citizens group now in terms of communicating with each other and transporting imagery and data and videos and so forth. So I'm thinking that all this digital connectivity is empowering the citizens to a great extent. So.
Absolutely. So I love this idea. What shall we call it? This your citizen group leaders.
handbook or whatever.
Handbook. Okay.
Yes.
Let's
Yeah.
call it a handbook for now. Let's
Right.
give it a placeholder name for now. I love the idea of a handbook. Something like this is sorely needed because there are lots of things you can do early on that don't cost any money that are
Right.
very important.
Right.
And or cost very little money that are very, very important. Is there anything else you'd like to share with our listeners?
Yes, there's one. I just remembered it. And my own personal contribution to the fight was probably about one thing. I had a friend in law school who had access to LexisNexis, the big database, which gets you into old newspaper records. It gets you into scientific journals. It gets you into legal documents that you don't get through Google. It's a very powerful database, and you have to, pay for it. You can get a subscription on a daily basis with your credit card. You can buy a monthly pass, or you can, if you're a big institution, you would have it as a matter of course. So my friend gave me access to LexisNexis, and I would get up early in the morning and I would go to the computer and I would type in a phrase like St. Lawrence Cement water violation, St. Lawrence Cement lawsuit, St. Lawrence Cement price fixing. And I put together a stack of stuff this deep that was just horrifying. I'm just unbelievable about all their operations around the world. In Europe, they had been busted multiple times for engaging in cartel activity, where they were fined hundreds of millions of dollars for colluding with other cement companies to fix prices. Their environmental, air quality, and water violations were everywhere. They had 14 plants in North America, out in Iowa, down in Baltimore, up in Canada. And the stories were just unbelievable. Toxic plumes that had been observed migrating from Michigan to Colorado. Canadian government officials standing up in the parliament in Toronto, raising holy hell about the way this company is abusing their community. I found just alarming stories. And we found one video of one of their plants in Eastern Europe where the citizens living near the cement plant literally had to wear masks on a daily basis. There was all this black schmutz coming out of the smokestack. So what that did was to undermine their credibility. We were able to show that their behavior as a corporate polluter in other places was well documented, and it was terrifying. And that went a long way towards pushing some people into a more aggressive stance against the company.
Thank you so much for bringing that up, because there were two important things about that. One is LexisNexis, while it's not free, it's relatively inexpensive.
I think about $25 a day. Yeah.
It and there probably are people who may not be able to give their personal time, but they'll be willing to contribute money to a cause. And the second thing I'd like to point out that's very important for the listeners is information can be found on LexisNexis that may not be available on the internet at no charge to the regular citizen, because the big guys have the ability to scrub defaming details about them from the net, from the free net. And it's going on every day. So just because you can't find something on the net doesn't mean it's not there. You can probably find it on LexisNexis.
I will send you a link. There's a site that tracks the violations and the penalties that these companies have paid, and it's just unbelievable. They literally budget for compliance violation penalties. Wow. The corporation is going to say to themselves, well, this year we're going to spend 26 million on violations, and they just plan for it.
If that doesn't give you the courage of your convictions, I guess nothing will. Well, thank you so much, Peter Jung, for joining me, and I hope all of you enjoyed this episode. Make sure to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast on all of your favorite platforms. And remember, no matter who you are, you can beat the big guys. Thanks so much, Peter. Hey, stay with me. Don't hang up. I'm just going to stop recording. And but the Zoom's going to continue. Hold on.